Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. Thank you very much for making time and giving an hour of your day, whether you're watching this live with us now or you're watching it on a recorded version later on. So today we're talking about fraud in the housing sector. It's our webinar. Fraud not on the agenda is the subject, following on from our white paper, which we did with Paul Roberts, who's on our screen as well, back in November of last year. I'm just going to give a brief introduction about myself, and Paul will do an introduction. I'll take you through what the structure is of today, and Paul will start setting the scene, and we're going to have a talk through. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Aaron Chohan. I'm a lawyer. I run this law firm, Tenet. We specialise in dealing with disputes, investigations, and compliance advice arising out of fraud and financial crime. We do a fair amount of work with housing associations. I've been working with housing associations on fraud issues since about 2011, back in my days at Colbit's TWF, and then since Tenet was set up about 9 years ago. I sit on the board of the Fraud Advisory Panel, and this really is a build on our work in the area with Paul Roberts. So Paul, do you want to do a brief intro before I set the format for the day?
Good to go. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Good to see you all. Really do appreciate everybody's time. I know there's plenty on. So I'm Paul Roberts. I'm a non-exec in the sector these days, along with being an independent consultant as well. And yeah, bit of a past history in the sector as an exec and being in other sectors too. So we'll explain a bit more as we get into the content.
Great, thanks, Paul. So the way we're going to do this is not death by PowerPoint. So you'll know we have these, we issue these kind of glossy guides, and we've got the one on fraud not on the agenda now. And rather than a death by PowerPoint, taking you through our 4 themes, which are awareness, prevention, detection and recovery, that come out from the white paper when it comes to dealing with fraud in the sector, we're going to talk it through on screen, and more of a conversational style. Anyone who's joined our webinars, at the Coalface webinars at Tenet, it's usually more of an interview chat talking about the subject. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk through those 4 themes over about 10 minutes each, and then talk about implementing a fraud strategy in the housing sector space, and some time for Q&A. We're really pleased in terms of the feedback we've had on the white paper. We've got nearly 100 people registered for the event today. And so for us, this is it's a really good move in the direction of people getting engaged on the subject. For everyone who knows, so this is being recorded after the webinar's finished. We'll be sending out a copy of the white paper. We've got a guide for MLROs, money laundering reporting officers in the sector. We'll send out, and a copy of the recording. I think that's all I need to cover. I think you'll find in the chat, Paula, my colleague, is putting links to the white papers and various documents. And we will try and deal with questions during the webinar as well as at the end, depending how me and Paul navigate that. So if you can put questions specifically in the Q&A function rather than the chat, we will try and keep an eye on it. Can't promise anything beyond that. So firstly, Paul, how did we get here? How are we talking about this? Can I get you to kind of set that scene before we dive into the first theme of awareness?
Yeah, I'll give it a good go. Thank you very much. So I came into looking at fraud risk really through a bit on the back end of my career as an exec, certainly subsequently as a non-exec in the sector, starting to look at this and the ESG agenda in particular. And I was really thinking about how we could make more of what looked like we were doing a great job around fraud, because we didn't seem to have much in the sector really. Yes, there'd been 1 or 2 big events, but pretty, other than that, low scale. So I began to dig into this a bit more, to think what more could we be doing around this, because it is something that we're all doing. It's just whether we're doing it well enough. It's not about another thing on top. And I've started to worry about whether things have become normalized, whether we had a bit of confirmation bias going on in the sector. I coined this phrase, nothing to see here, which was where we got to with our first white paper last year. And, when a sector's got 13.2 billion of operating expenditure, it's about the same in terms of capital spend as well. And yet we've got so little fraud in our sector. Well, I started to get slightly more concerned about all of that. So I twisted Aaron's arm after I thought he did a brilliant job in terms of his presentation. He is always the expert. I am just the advocate in all of this, really. And, we started a round table back in 23 that moved into a couple of conferences, the NHF, speaking events, a webinar like this. culminating really in not only getting a white paper out on the back of that, but then having our own conference that was hosted by Fraud Risk Massage up in Birmingham here, which was great. Really appreciate their engagement with it, because I think it's really important to get our professional services involved as well. And before we know it, we're here at another white paper, and here we are talking about it. So that's hopefully a quick snapshot.
That's great, Paul. Thanks. And I think it's important to show that journey that we started from that round table, and we've gone to we put on a conference, and there's just more and more engagement, which is really positive, because the more people talk about it, the more we're going to do something about it in the sector. Now, our first theme we're going to talk through is about awareness. Now, for me, people who've heard me speak about this before, I talk about awareness in terms of that many other sectors see fraud as a big issue. And we have many other sectors who will do quite a lot about fraud in their kind of 3 lines of defense model, from financial services in terms of the operations, the compliance, and the internal audit. And then you set that against the backdrop that 38% of all crime in the UK is fraud and cybercrime. But yet we have this kind of theme here of many nil returns going in from housing associations to the regulator. And that's where we came up with that first, or Paul came up with the first theme of the fraud. There's nothing to see here. Why is it that this sector has the secret sauce? And I'm going to share a slide in a moment, just briefly. It's the only slide. I promise it's not death by PowerPoint. And maybe I'll do that while I'm talking. But I just put that on screen for the moment. And what we have is a situation where you'll have the sector risk profile put limited focus on fraud. So housing associations will talk about fraud less in their organisation because it's not a priority on the sector risk profile. That leads to less detection and discussion around fraud. That leads to more nil returns. Nil returns tell the regulator fraud's not really a big issue in the sector, so it's limited on the sector risk profile. And we go around in that kind of flow. And in reality, we know there's been a lot of effort in terms of looking at fraud, certainly from the tenancy fraud angle, and absolutely, it's a massive part of getting homes back in the right people. So we always are really impressed, and it's great to see all the work by the Tenancy Fraud Forum. Huge advocates out there, like one of our speakers last year, and Andy Lane from Cornerstone Chambers. So Andy, if you're here, that's my shout out to you. But Paul, my question really to talk about for awareness is why is it that we think fraud and the sector, we think tenancy fraud, but what about other areas? What is it that we're not thinking about? Well, why can't fraud affect development? Why aren't we looking at repairs and maintenance? Why aren't we looking at just governance as a whole on this? What's your take on that?
Yeah, but we're doing that. We have audit and risk committees. I am a group chair of 2 audit and risk committees, and we do that. Well, we kind of do. We have internal audit plans. We look at our internal controls. We try to make sure we're joining the dots. But I think awareness, one of the reasons, just stepping back a sec, the reason we thought about the 4 themes when we were doing this is to try and put this into bite-sized chunks for people. When you're thinking about fraud risk across the whole organisation, awareness, then prevention, detection, and recovery and return. And then you can start to think about, how do we do awareness as part of the whole process? What are we aware of? Do we really understand the throughput? A surprise, I think, that came out from the conference, because we had a guest speaker from outside of the sector, and I think it's been something that you've often told me, as having worked with other sectors on fraud as well, as it's such a surprise that, with the size of the supply chain we have, with the ecosystem that we have, we don't seem to be seeing much in that area. We've got controls. Are they strong enough? Are they good enough? We'll come to that in a short while. It is great that we have the focus on tenancy fraud, but if you look at in the white paper, we talked about the freedom of information stats that were pulled out in an article last year, and take a look at those stats. Yeah, the high volume is tenancy fraud, but the value put to that is low. There's a small number of development frauds, but the value is higher. But again, the supply chain is really lacking in there. It's possibly in the other section of the stats. But, there is such a wide range of fraud risk for us. And yeah, we can focus on certain key areas in there. And I think it's really important that there is an awareness to do that. Fraud risk is across the whole organisation. When we look at a sort of gap analysis around awareness, we're thinking about it across every function of the business. And then that helps to help people join the dots about how they need to be talking to one another, how they need to triangulate what's happening in the housing piece, and is that being informed by repairs and maintenance? Is that going over to governance? How do we join that up? And I think it's not just about the people doing the do in the organisations, it's about do board members, and that was really keen to try and get as many board members on this webinar as possible. Are we thinking more broadly when we come to sign off nil returns? Does that make sense? Does it year after year of nil returns? You might get away with it for 1 year, but year after year. So the awareness of all those areas and the fringes of fraud that are coming through, you know, accreditations, fraud, disrepair, where it's bogus claims, gas capping, you know, there's stuff on the horizon and different methods coming through that we've got to be aware of, not just the specific areas, but certainly the supply chain was a key surprise for people, given the value and activity in that we're not capturing, seeing more in there, or have we normalized some elements of it? Is the real risk? It's a cost of doing business.
Yeah, and I think my take on it is that with our work, we're doing more with providers in the sector. We're seeing this one theme coming out to me is that fraud isn't really being defined particularly well. So, for example, you know, nil returns isn't really about, there's no materiality issue in that. It's, you can have small frauds, you can have large frauds, you can have near misses, but they're not finding their way onto the returns. And is that because we don't see fraud as fraud? We've talked about things like value leakage being an explanation for wasted money in a supply chain or repairs and maintenance, or was it something more sinister? We don't think of small frauds. I know we've had one recent engagement where they were talking about cleaners taking the pledge out of properties when they're doing it and keeping it for themselves. Well, clearly not very material, but how do we define it? And we get onto this subject of how do we bring fraud to life for these different departments in every organization? If everyone's thinking about fraud in the same way, and talking about it in the same way, then we're more likely to discover more, which we'll come on to. So that need for policies to have an awareness which talks about practical examples of this is what actually fraud looks like, you know, and don't leave it to people for interpretation. And that links to a few things. One, we started to realize this light bulb going off that actually if fraud occurs and it involves our organization, our supply chain, there's likely to be a money laundering issue within that. There might be proceeds of crime created. How do we coordinate that? And I think in the chat we'll put our money laundering guide. But also now we've got the failure to prevent fraud offence that comes in from the 1st of September 2025, and that's come out of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. And if you look at Schedule 12 of that Act, it's got 5 pages of legislation which defines fraud. And I ask anyone on this call to go and look at that and think, well, would we have any nature in this organisation or our ecosystem, be it from our supply chain, our employees? And it's interesting when we've gone out and talked to organisations, and we've done the training side or we've done other work, what we find is when you ask people, what does fraud mean to you as an individual? It's quite different to what they think about fraud in a business context, and certainly in the context of the association. So there's this kind of corporate maturity we're starting to pull away at an awareness, which is, should we be doing the right thing to try and prevent financial crime and fraud, rather than are we just trying to prevent an engagement with the regulator on a big fraud? So it's that joining it all up. And I think that's my point, really. I think about awareness. We don't have as I say, we as a sector, I don't think we have a uniform approach to what fraud is. And I think, does that really play into why prevention is much harder, because we don't know what we're looking to prevent?
Yeah, and interestingly, I mean, you know, as much as it's in the sector risk profile, good, section 5.16 or something right at the back every year, it's there, but it's not exactly prominent. Back to that vicious circle that we can turn into a virtuous circle if we can share the information more effectively and report things more effectively. But back to this point about definition, really important. A common distaste for fraud. That was from one of your previous coalface, I think, webinars that I picked out that phrase about the language of fraud, just generally in society. Yeah. It's really true for our sector. If we don't have a better understanding and definition, and we all allow us to think that's okay, that's not okay, you know, we're not clear, and we'll come to language and culture and, you know, where zero tolerance does take us, or whether it should be about do not tolerate. I mean, that's really important. But I do think consistent, clear, relevant internal and external comms. How many people have that link on their website to make sure that people can report tenancy fraud as another route to, it's not all about the patch management bit of sending that intel into the organization, how, people going into various homes and access issues are brought together. But that continuous comms piece is a really helpful awareness piece for everybody across the whole business, and it isn't just about the sheep dip training that we're always worried about with awareness. How do we get horizon scanning right? We've got some good ideas, I think, to share as part of what we're trying to build on best practices. Having a comms community that's really strong, sending out the same messages consistently in the sector, because that will help keep people safe, keeps homes safe, keeps reputations safe. That's what we're trying to do. And I was just doing some mandatory training at one of the organisations I'm a non-exec at, and it's been 2 years since I've done my anti-fraud and bribery. But I don't have to do that for a little while longer. And then, but it actually was about anti-bribery and money laundering. It didn't say anything about anti-fraud. And what's been coming up on the horizon since? Should I be kept in the loop? I'm needing to do that for myself. A good, strong comms group working together would really help keep everybody from boardroom right through the business informed and up to date. So training and development isn't just for Christmas.
Yeah, that's a lovely little tale to tell everyone to go home with, isn't it? It's not for Christmas. But just as I said, we'll try and pick up questions as we go along as well. I know Mick Hopkins has put in a question, and Mick was one of our speakers at the conference from the Shared Anti-Fraud Service, so thanks, Mick. But he's broadly saying, look, 1.6 to 5% is the percentage of likely fraud in large organisations year on year. Should returns by registered providers to the regulator try to estimate what they think is the fraud level going through their organisation, as opposed to just reporting on the return? So make them think about fraud and what's the likely throughput of fraud in their organisation. Would that at least force estimates? Would that cause a change? What's your take on that from working within a number of organisations?
I think we're coming into the prevention area, aren't we? Because as much as about the awareness and what that would help us do if we shared that information, I think that prevention of having the knowledge in your business of the near misses as well as the ones that you're calling fraud. I mean, some people hold back and say it wasn't fraud, we didn't prove it, therefore it's not fraud. But on the other hand, what have we learned from the health and safety world and that area of compliance? Because as you just explained with the various regulations that are around us, fraud is a compliance issue, and yet we tend to find fraud by chance. So I think the more we're reporting it as part of our policies that we put in place to say we should be reporting this insofar as internally, and then we work with the regulator about how we want to improve that level of reporting. And it's one of the things that we want to do to strengthen the sector is we want to talk to the regulator about not only what they put in the sector risk profile, but how do we use the fraud risk return that we all do, unless you're less than 1,000 homes. I don't know why that matters, but to let the regulator know what is happening in the sector, and then how we do value that more consistently to Mick's point, so that we know what sort of value there is to fraud risk in our sector and the types that are coming through. And that's how we keep informed. That's how we keep informed from a health and safety point of view, by understanding the different types, the near misses, and stops us having bigger risks to mitigate later on. Absolutely true for fraud as well.
It is true. I think when we talk about, you mentioned earlier about, engaging with more board members, but it's not just that classic guidance we get on, the Bribery Act and now the Failure to Prevent Fraud offence, about tone of, the zero tolerance, phrase you get, but it's that tone of the team. And part of the thing we had from our discussions and in the white paper and the conference was Patrick, right, from WSP, who's from outside the sector. And he talked about moving away from whistleblowing to this concept of business integrity and culture. And we're starting to see that thread as a really vital thread on prevention. So what Patrick's broad approach was to say, and you'll read more about this in the white paper, is, look, you're asking people to blow the whistle in a whistleblowing strict sense. What you're asking people to be is judge and jury. They have to identify wrongdoing, assess its wrongdoing in their own mind, be brave enough to call out a colleague potentially for undertaking some wrongdoing, and report it, and believe in anonymity and believe in confidentiality in the process. If they were asked instead to report on a breach of our integrity, our ethics, our values, where they felt people weren't living or operating that way, it's a lot softer. They're engaging more often, and they are likely to flag not just the event after it's happened, but the risks of an event potentially happening. And so he has this big kind of approach. Look, focus on business integrity and ethics, and we've started to play that out in training and other areas, and we're seeing there's a buy into that because if you put fraud in that business ethics and integrity piece, and talk about not doing, doing the right thing, not doing the wrong thing, and calling that out as behaviors, we're getting more people talking about what they think is the tone of the team for fraud in the organization. And then you start to get examples of, well, do we call this fraud or do we not call that fraud? And it's a natural deterrent within an organization in terms of prevention. And this is where I think if we talk about prevention, I think the classic on audit and risk committee view, and Paul, correct me if you're wrong, it's what have we done to think about what frauds are in the sector as opposed to frauds that we might have in our organization? Have we got a risk register that notes those? And have we got a policy that deals with how we prevent it? And I think those policies sit still and they're not practicable. They don't tell real examples and they're not kept alive by the people who are actually living through them. So what's your view on prevention and policies and procedures? And we've obviously seen a few over our time now, but what's your take on that as a key issue for prevention?
Let's have some key part of our internal controls. If they're missing, oh dear, that's obviously a key one. But when they don't talk to one another, when they don't link into what the rest of it, they're not real. They're kind of they've been done, but really not thought about in the broader context of the business. How is that the controls working? I'm really keen as well that our professional providers, the auditors in particular, are there. We work with them on what the internal audit plan is, and we ask them to check various key controls and stuff. But that's with what we know as well. We work with what we need to be all doing is having that broader awareness, that horizon scanning that really helps us have better informed audits to make sure that yes, the policies and procedures are there. We'll come to detection in a minute because policy and procedure isn't enough in itself, but that's the fundamentals. And a lot of organizations will say we're doing great on awareness, we're doing great on prevention, but as you start to pull at that, but in what context? How often do you talk about this? Where is it talked about? When these policies and procedures talk to one another, does person X working in this part of the business link in with person Y, and the whole story of a fraud risk and its mitigation? That starts to get missed. And great comment from Alan Mullender at the conference that we had, which really woke people up, was trust is not a control. And in our internal controls, it can't be. So I think we've talked a number of times, haven't we, about making sure that we're aware of what it means for us. As you said, there's an environmental risk full stop around fraud with society. There is specifics around the sector, but it's what's important to you as your organization. Your organizations and where you've got higher and lower risk. You've got people changing all the time, systems changing, regulations, the means by which people can defraud you, as well as complications that come through in the organization. You've got to be aware of those. And again, back to the training and awareness that comes with to support the prevention is making sure there's a bit of a rating around which bits of your business are more of a risk to you, and making sure that's done on a regular basis. It's surprising how many people don't think about where, how things have moved in terms of there's a greater risk in one particular area, or indeed particular risk in one role. The number of times we talk about fraud is not a victimless crime, how it makes people feel when fraud happens within their organization, how they didn't spot it, how they, the most surprising person did it, the culture piece that comes with it. Culture is the glue to prevention, there's no doubt about it, that, policies and procedures or whatever, but that corporate maturity bit you talked about, the tone that's set, I thought was really great what Patrick said at the conference, and it really hit home, didn't it, to people? Yeah, you have the tone from the top, whether you use zero tolerance, then you've got to walk that talk, or you say do not tolerate. But the grassroots groundswell, I thought was a really brilliant comment about people want to do a good job, they want to make the right things happen. And in our sector, in housing, people really want to make that happen. Tenancy fraud's a brilliant example. People can see how many people are in overnight accommodation, temporary accommodation, homes being abused. It's not what we're about, it's the purpose bit, as well as the financial bit, which we'll come on to. But it's the purpose bit that drives people to say, this can't be right. And our customers say that too. And they tell us that, why aren't you doing something about it, which is part of the trust bit. So there are many eyes and ears to prevention. It's not just about a dry policy and procedure. It's about the culture that goes with it to make sure that it works. It's about being proactive rather than reactive, which, let's face it, in the sector and on compliance issues, we've got a bit of a track record of being reactive. It's tough out there, I absolutely get it, but it's about how we move the dial to being more proactive about things. And sometimes when we're already doing it, it's just about smartening up the way we do it. And I think fraud's one of those areas for me. We're doing a lot of this. How well are we doing it? Which we'll come back to.
Yeah, I think that we're already doing something is good. It's a good point, because if you look at that, using fraud as a way to improve culture in a way, we're seeing it. So through learning and development teams and training, fraud's touched upon on inductions. We see there's not regular training on fraud, or there's not graduated training, which I mean by if someone gets a promotion, they get a bit more emphasis on fraud training because they've got more responsibility. But by having that training, you're getting people communicating more often about fraud, and people naturally look for it. And where you say it's like Alan and Bromford have done a great job on how they approach fraud. It's a great example. Alan Morland at Bromford. Yeah, they know trust is not control, but they also know that they've got to trust their people to help protect each other. And so by talking about it more often, more people are doing that. And that's what we found is good in prevention. James Tickell at the conference, he talked about, really how good people can do bad things. And he talked through how people will sometimes commit fraud because they're trying to help their local church, as one example he gave. And I think we just have to open our eyes that, we're not just looking for the wrong uns, the bad people out there. Fraud, and that's why defining fraud and understanding how we might perceive behaviour as something that comes into fraud is important for all our people. And that all goes towards prevention. So you've got to think about, your strategy of everyone communicating. You've got to think about your strategy on policies, ease of finding policies as well. You've got to think about that learning and development and talking about it every 6 months, at least on the agenda in team meetings. You will start to find you don't have to do a lot more to get your fraud strategy in place.
Yeah.
Yes,
sorry. I was just going to say, again, James, great speaker as he is, on most subjects in the sector, but at the conference, he talked about that chronic unease approach to compliance issues, which we've absolutely got when it comes to asset management. Fraud, have we got the same chronic unease? And we've been asked, haven't we, from asset management, again, to have that constructive curiosity, what we see when we go into homes. What does that mean? Let's join the dots. Part of the prevention is joining the dots when people are going in the homes, whether it's tenancy fraud, whether it's risks that come from a safeguarding point of view. I'm really keen to think about it in the context of illegal gas tapping, those sorts of gas capping is another example, money laundering and fraud risks that come with those, that we're providing that support. We understand our customers as well as we understand the implications in our organisation. So when we're thinking about hot or cold properties that we regularly visit or we don't visit, and what's going on there and access issues, is there something here that it doesn't take much to join the dots on a complex case to sort of say, hang on, is there a risk here around fraud? What does it mean for our reputation? Anyway, sorry, I'll keep moving. Next theme.
No. Next theme. Well, it does tie all into detection. Yeah. We're having more people talking about it, and I think what you start to realise, or what I've realised from conversations with some registered providers, is because they haven't talked about fraud at all historically, they don't think of it as an explanation for something. So I know we had one conversation with a provider where they talked about some kind of irregular level of refunds to tenants. And it just dawned on them in a conversation, well, could there be a fraud risk in this? And you and I were nodding quite vigorously saying, yeah, we think so. but they hadn't turned their mind to it. And I think that's part of how detection is starting to improve. We also, I think, kind of look at detection as a silo. In that detection in fraud is not just about recovery of money. Naturally, it's about recovering of assets if we're thinking in tenancy fraud and misuse of property, not principal home and all this stuff that goes with that. But it's the non-financial returns that benefit from detection. I know you've talked a lot about kind of ESG, you've talked about social value. Do you want to unpack that? Because you're always better advocate than me on those topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we do the gap analysis, and when we've done this with either training development or in terms of when we talk to people about their fraud maturity and what they could do to improve their good practice, I think you get to awareness and prevention, people think, yeah, and then you present some challenges and people think, yeah, it could be better here and now, flushes out the improvements. Detection, recovery and return, maybe the poorer relations of the four themes that we've come up with. And, detection is about resourcing. It is really difficult. People, particularly in the tenancy sustainment world of our organizations, are doing many multiple things at the same time. And what's really interesting is local authorities have really still managed to keep some of that fraud detection resource in place and are seeing the returns on that, particularly in tenancy fraud. As you say, Mick from Staff's Tenancy Fraud Forum, recent article in HQN magazine, I think, identifies that. So there are returns to be had, pounds for sure. There's value for money, cost leakage, as we talk about, the time and effort that goes into whether it's tenancy fraud or investigating other frauds. If culture's going to do the job for you, to build the right sort of trust, that's going to save you money. I'm thinking about what it means in terms of insurance. You talked about that on a regular basis in terms of insurance cost saving. Funders, I mean, one of the elephant in the room for us is if we start saying there's fraud in the sector, will our funders take flight? And I can appreciate the regulator wants to be mindful of that, but we should know. We should be, if we're good at it, it's something that's a virtue for us, and maybe the finance sector might recognise that. But it's again part of that good ESG governance. I think social value is really important both to our customers but also our colleagues. Keeping people safe in an environment where there is all sorts of devious methods of fraud taking place, not just about cyber, but including cyber and the digital agenda. I think there's a lot there that we need to think about how we get our messages out. Back to that communications piece, the external communications is really valuable. We want to engage our customers and communities, our colleagues, keep them safe, build trust. So there's a return there as well. So I think there are a number of returns, but you only get the returns if you can start to do the detection, isn't it? And make sure that the good processes you put in place in terms of prevention are coming through, and you have to test them. That's the detection bit, isn't it? How you test them, where are things on your risk register? The big one for me as a board member is assurance, not reassurance, assurance. How do I know? What are we doing? We haven't found, we've got nil returns. How come? Finding fraud by chance is not the answer for us. And I think, again, to be proactive, but yes, getting the risk register in place, the basic reporting at times, our finance or IT running those key reports on an organized, regular basis. Is somebody monitoring that? I'm not saying it's the top KPI that people need to have, but is it there in a suite of KPIs that's looked at on occasion, certainly before you do the fraud risk return? How do we know people are joining up the dots involving that constructive curiosity in the business and thinking, if it's this and it's that, could it also be a fraud risk issue as well? So that lateral thinking is really important. And, if as a board member, and one of the things I've talked about is if there's a push through the organisation to share information, the information's there, where's the pull? Where's the pull coming from? Audit and risk committees in particular to sort of sense check. Yeah, that's the assurance we want, because again, the parallel is with health and safety, with asset management. We do that. We look for that assurance. Do we do the same? Relying on what's said in the external audit report or in an internal audit program where we decide every couple of years we're doing a defined piece of work, is that sufficient when there's already reports and work ongoing in the business that we could just sense check as part of a broader assurance framework, and it's there. We just need to bring it to life, to use it, to join the dots, to put in the structure. That for me is the thing that seems to be a key thing for a lot of organisations, is structure, a structured approach to detection, not about trying to create another department when there's limited resources. I could give you another example around tenancy fraud if I've got a moment, which would be something like short-term tenancy fraud. We all know therefore that it's out there. Airbnb, Verbo, Booking.com. It's out there. We know that's happening. So we've got the classic tenancy frauds. Now we've got the short-term tenancy frauds. People's policies about lodgers and all that sort of stuff need tightening up and understanding what they allow, they don't allow. But, you know, throughput of people in a household, repairs risks, ASB risks, all that sort of stuff. What are we doing to tackle that reality that is in there? And it's not just in urban areas, it can also be elsewhere. I've spent the last year, as you know, talking to various people about a bit of software we're trying to pilot, which is free, just to try it out, which will show people about the hotspots of where it's, you know, Airbnb, Booking.com have got activity, and you can put that to your hotspots of your postcodes and where your stock is. I've tested it out myself on locations I'm aware of, and I can see that potentially there are risks of, you know, properties that are affordable housing that are popping up on these sites. It's about how it's used. So this software is called Letting Lens. I'm happy to share it with people if they want to have a look at it and are involved in the pilot. But again, it's part of that broader piece of making sure we're clear about how homes are kept safe, people are kept safe, and our reputations are kept safe, because there's a lot of risk that's building there. So ask is the question from audit and risk committees, and make sure that detection process is joining up with what you've put as your good policies and procedures in a structured approach. Then we start to flush stuff out. Then we can think about how we report and what we report more effectively.
Yeah, and I think if you pull something from what you're talking about, it seems to me if you get the awareness bit right, your detection is going to come about, because people are going to actually actively look for things which are unusual patterns. They're going to use data. I mean, one of the things we've seemed to have landed on quite a bit is that how, you know, the sector is very busy. It is really hard on people to have something else to think about, and be it from a board perspective or ELT. But people, we have to be conscious that people can be busy and they can also be overwhelmed. And if they drift into overwhelmed, people just focus down and they won't help. So you've got to make sure your people have got headroom space just to think about it. And that comes from that program, from awareness to prevention. That helps detection. But we've started to think about detection in other areas. We're seeing, you know, I've mentioned development before, whether people are having a write-off on a development because they just think it's gone wrong, or actually what were they told at the outset of the development and their investment, or even the asset disposals before they committed to those contracts, compared to what's happened after. Were they misrepresented something? Is there a loss there where it's an actionable claim? Do we even know that's an actionable claim? Contract management is something else we've talked a lot about with organisations. But you can see, just going back to tenancy fraud, there was the Lost Homes, Lost Hope report from the Fraud Advisory Panel's Tenancy Fraud Forum, a great piece of work. Alan Bryce pushed hard on that, and it showed for every home we recover, that's a value of about £42,000. There is a lot of value in detection if we start to recognise it, and if we get that right, then you can get into, I guess, the part to move into now is recovery, the fourth of the themes. I think we almost self-reject ourselves in this sector, in the sense of thinking we're not going to make recoveries, so let's not try. And there's almost a preemptive self-rejection of approach, in my perspective, that there is quite a lot you could do. We know about, you know, POSHPA and recovering on tenancy fraud, but in these wider areas, development, contract management, you can get returns. Your take about, you know, do we just think about recovery from kind of larger corporate type frauds, or do we think about recovery from the smaller instances where it might be systemic?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, so really interesting, harking back to the conference. We started the day and asked for a sort of word cloud, which is in the white paper, about what you think of when you think of fraud risk. And we moved from quite a lot of detailed comments, particularly a high level of focus on subletting tenancy fraud, to culture, to the returns that we could be making about purpose, to a degree value for money for the organisation. So, you know, the day and the discussions moved people's thinking, which I think was really important. When we're trying to move the recovery piece on, we have got the challenge of saying, well, is there a financial return? How is it going to help my operating margin? Always a debate as to whether the tenancy fraud baseline, like social value, you know, isn't that a bit of a high figure? And we can start talking about the number, but what about the principle, the purpose piece, that making sure homes are being used for the right purpose, to the right people? So, you know, there's a value in that. There's a value in getting the culture right to make sure, you know, that we prevent the risks to our organisation. So I do think, you know, recovery and return are harder to justify in hard cash terms for people to actually see in our operating margin. Sometimes it's a counterfactual of what you've actually could have avoided, that, you know, is hard to prove. But there are other non-financial benefits that are really quite powerful, and yet as a sector we're not doing that. And Mick's earlier comment about understanding the volume of activity. So if you take, you mentioned impairment and development, well, that's a really interesting one. Some interesting valuations that eventually get written down, and where does the money flow in terms of some of that. That was an interesting one from the conference, where people talked about where money flows out to the likes of Malta, and, you know, from various deals. Yeah, there's those. And you talked about small to big frauds. Again, that was a real highlight that people talked about. Yeah, we're looking for the, you know, the big bad frauds, absolutely, and we should be, of course. There's just the lower level of smaller frauds that add up for any organisation, and certainly add up across the sector, that just isn't coming through. And it's so obvious when you think about it, when you've got homes and housing stock in various areas. How can you have a nil return year on year that says you found no tenancy fraud? But it's just, you know, how can that be? And then, you know, got low level activity, particularly again back into that supply chain, where there's all sorts of risks around everything from stock management, purchase cards, and, you know, expense fraud that's broader across the organisation too. So you'd hope to be on top of those all the time, but stuff happens. So I think recovery, it's about what you said about corporate maturity. You want to do it because it builds trust. It's a better organisation. You can use fraud risk to really underpin the values of your organisation. So recovery and return, I believe there are some hard cash benefits, but it's certainly a huge amount of non-financial benefits to any organisation that, you know, walks the talk in that respect.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're finding, is that togetherness that comes out from talking about fraud is quite, it's almost a byproduct I don't think we even gave enough credence to when we started this kind of approach. Interesting on recovery, because I guess the litigator in me looks at it, and I think organisations sometimes might, I certainly know of a few instances where a fraud has been discovered and it's quite low level, few £1,000s, and they just say, right, okay, well, we've dealt with that, but they don't pull at the thread. And I've seen one instance, someone talked about it recently, where it was, you know, roughly 10k, and then when they pulled at the thread, they found this was a 6-year fraud, and hundreds of thousands of pounds had been going on. And the white paper, we talk about recovery, we talk about, you know, the really important early stage action steps. We did this with Dasher from Forvis Mazars, about what you do through your stages of an investigation, and that's detailed in the white paper as well. So just knowing what to do actually helps you on recovery as well. Because I've done lots of talks where I've had organisations or sectors, even to charities as an example, where there's a kind of headless chicken moment on recovery, which is, we think we might have something gone wrong. We don't know who to speak to, internal auditors, lawyers, who deals with this internally, who's got ownership of it. And the speed and process, which should be part of your policy and procedure on how to respond to fraud, is only going to improve your monetary returns. But also talking about those returns in your organisation is going to improve your awareness and culture as well. So that's really important, I think, for anybody who's thinking about, you know, where are the recoveries? It is monetary and non-monetary, and to say it's It's not just about recovering cost leakage. Now, we're just going to talk a little bit about implementing a fraud strategy, and then if anybody has any questions, I think we've had that one from Mick. I don't think there's any others in the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A. Please throw stuff there. Otherwise, we might just chat about Wrexham Football Club to make Paul happy, and I don't want to do that for too long.
We'll lose people, unfortunately.
We might lose people. We might lose people. It's true. So, implementing a fraud strategy. One of the things we've got about is this heat map, which is what do we think the heat map shows in terms of likelihood of fraud and the impact of fraud, classic risk matrix for different divisions of every organization, be it development, be it IT, be it governance, be it finance, and we've done that because we then are speaking to organizations and then saying, actually, we think the heat map is something different. We think there's a greater likelihood here, or there's less knowledge here, and we grade this against awareness, prevention, detection, and recovery. And one of the things I've noted on fraud strategy, Paul, I don't know if you find the same, is that we seem to think when we start to talk to these different divisions in an organization, a lot of them think the others have it. The others are looking out for it. So contract management, they think, well, procurement are looking at fraud post-award. Procurement post-fraud are thinking finance are looking at it. We've done our job of onboarding with the procurement regs, and it's falling between the gaps. So part of fraud strategy, again, is that being joined up. But what's your kind of idea about implementing the heat map, which is working really well? What's your take on the benefits you've seen from it so far?
Well, it's forced that sort of more holistic thinking and spotting the gaps. It is about mind the gap. It's a gap analysis thing at the end of the day, as well as a heat map. For sure, it's a simplistic way of trying to get different parts of the organization talking to one another. People have views on other parts of the organization and how it links to what they do, and bringing that through. So that's great. Ideas and suggestions coming from various, from the questions of why don't we do that? Yeah, that usually prompts stuff. For me, it's all part of the assurance piece as well. I mean, if I could see how that map works each year, then it's better for me to then think about, right, what should be on my risk register? Where should it be on my risk register? Where should the mitigations be coming through? It's part of that audit trail to assurance that I feel at the moment sometimes it's there, it's patchy within organizations, but it could be just structured better. And that's what we're suggesting with this sort of approach. So, I think that's part of the sort of backbone to really trying to have good, strong controls, knowing what they are, knowing how they should be applied, when they should be applied. It comes through in having that discussion and thinking about it holistically across the organization. And as I say, it's applicable, I think, whether it's audit and risk committees and boards and them trying to understand their risk appetites and culture, right through to trying to work through the practicalities of delivering services in our organizations, and how we lead our people, and how we make sure we have good hand-ons to one another, not hand-offs. With the Six Nations coming up, hand-offs means a completely different thing, doesn't it? So hand-ons between people of this particular complex case or involvement, and how we make the most of that. So I think it's really important that, it helps to do that joining the dots.
Yeah, I think that people will see the thread about the joining the dots coming through a lot. I think if you're an organisation and you're thinking, well, how do we start? I think just start by asking all departments right now, what do they do to think about fraud? How are they educating themselves about fraud risk in their roles and their relevant department? And what do they think is the fraud risk? And just let them have a healthy discussion about it, because that will help educate governance, assurance, compliance teams in relation to implementing controls that actively work for an organisation. I think we're seeing that there is a real benefit for linking a fraud strategy to your comms teams. We haven't talked really about comms teams, and we're going to try and start to put together some ideas for comms teams to just kind of have a consistent fraud strategy. That seems to be something useful. And policies, I've seen a lot of policies, in organisations where bribery will be a separate policy, money laundering will be a separate policy, fraud will be a separate policy. In my world, I'm not saying I've got it right, But I think you have a fraud prevention policy, which covers all areas of the business, and that's fed into by this constant engagement with teams saying, oh, we've seen a near miss or we've seen a risk, feed it in, develop your fraud prevention policy. A fraud response and recovery policy. What are you going to do if what type of fraud happens? Cyber, procurement, a code of conduct, policy around money laundering, and let's call it a business integrity policy, but really a whistleblowing policy. Got those 5, and everyone understands them, and they know where they are, and making sure external parties can find your policies as well to blow the whistle easily on your website, you're going to be in a much better place. So we're not advocating seismic changes and lots of work. We're just saying let's start thinking smarter about it. So those are my thoughts on what we're learning from implementing a strategy. Anything to round up before I kind of round us up and see if there's any questions, Paul?
No, I mean, I think that's a really good roundup of what we've been trying to talk about. And, cyber was the one. They haven't mentioned cyber yet, and we talk about in the white paper the different types of cyber risks there are, and it's really good. I've seen good practice out there where people do, it's important to engage the IT community to help them inform you where the cyber risks are coming from, how many attacks you've had, what types they are, doing the basic testing, those sorts of things. Again, part of that important part of not just policies, but detection, but then informing you. There is that circle of trying to make sure that we keep well informed in something that is very dynamic. You can't have a static controls process around fraud risk to what is a very dynamic environment. It just,
yeah, that's exactly right.
So we've got to keep it alive, but then, that's just sensible from a compliance point of view in keeping ahead of the game and trying to remain proactive. But yeah, if anything comes out of this is about not trying to add more stuff on for people to do. There's loads on. It's not trying to say this is more of a priority than anything else. It's just part of the set of priorities. But it's about saying, let's recognize the good practice that we've already got and build on it. Again, we're trying to talk about that in the white paper. And it isn't just about us all doing it individually. There's strength in the sector of working together on this, comms communities collaborating together, people understanding where the best practice is. That was a surprise coming out of the conference. People, they just didn't know where to look for best practice. And I think it's true of our third-party providers as professional services. There's a lot more they can be continuing to do to help us, share that better practice, help us with lateral thinking. It keeps us safe. Really keen. I get the regulator's position that, I don't want them to tell me anymore about what I've got to do. I'm aware of what I've got to do. We just need to make sure we are doing it. And, with their help to promote that fraud risk is a bigger reality than that perhaps is suggested in the returns, and sharing the data, because if we send the data in, it's important to get it back, isn't it? To understand where those risks are. We can keep informed. So the horizon scanning thing is absolutely crucial for me. Where is it coming from? What do we do?
Okay, well, thanks, Paul. So yeah, for me, empowering our people, using our people, and we'll get a better strategy. So a few roundup things. I've got a couple of questions as well. We've mentioned at the opening slide, there's a LinkedIn group, nothing to see here, which is for the sector. We're trying to people to drive more dialogue in that. We don't just want me and Paul or Paula and the team to see good practice, share it, any helps. So get involved in that. We will be talking about cyber in our next conference, our conference for the housing sector on fraud, our annual conference. We're going to have another run at that this year, 2nd of October. The last slide that will come up today will be a QR code for that. So please, register your interest. It would be great to have you there. We're sharing the recording in the white paper, but equally, if there's anything you want to talk about or think about in relation that comes out of this, and you just want to have a conversation with either Paul, myself, or both of us, just get in touch. We're always happy to talk. Right, a few questions. Do you think the regulator should better define materiality rather than leaving it to individuals of housing association to decide what is material? You've got 1 minute. Go.
Materiality, there's an interesting subject, and isn't it linked to not just what you say about materiality in terms of external audit? That's one place. Isn't it more about the culture of the organization? It's back to that debate about zero tolerance or do not tolerate. It's about what feels appropriate with the values of your organization. Is it for the regulator to tell us what materiality is? Or is it for us to really want to know what our risks are, and then have a better way of reporting and sharing that, and understanding what near misses are in the context of materiality, as well as defined frauds themselves. But we have to have sensible levels of materiality. But if we learn things from health and safety compliance, is that if we don't recognize when we have these sorts of risks, we don't mitigate effectively. So small frauds can become big frauds. In finance, the money that goes out, that's £10 this week, could be 10,000 the next week once they found the loophole. You've got to be proportionate about it and sensible. But we talked about larger and smaller organizations in the sector. Those with the less than 1,000 homes, it's really difficult for them to know how to tackle this subject. But on the other hand, they're facing the same risks as we are, and materiality to them is huge.
Yeah, and I think for me, materiality, don't look at anything in isolation, because it could be part of a systemic issue, and you've got to pull that thread. And materiality, there's materiality for the regulator, and there's materiality for you as an organization. What is material? And they start there. What's important to you as an organization is about materiality when it comes to dishonesty. What are you going to say, we'll just let that pass on? And then you can determine where you go with the regulator. Another question we've got here, and I'll try and deal with it first and chip in, Paul. Do you think there's too much focus on money with regards to fraud, concentrating on preventing large sums and less awareness of other types? I think that's particularly true. I think we can have situations where we've got, tenant schemes, and our data for those tenants can lead to loan sharks and companies attacking those individuals. So data and fraud is a really big issue right now. People's personal identity being stolen, and we are in control of that data. What are we doing to demonstrate the importance of that data in the hands of the wrong people, so that we protect our tenants and our own people as well? So that's a good example. I think materiality also doesn't then come down to just the monetary aspect when you're looking at fraud. So I think it's a really good question. I think we are looking at money slightly more than we should when it comes to fraud. There are other types.
But there's quality. I mean, if there's something we've learned, particularly in terms of construction and maintenance, it's importance of understanding the quality of the products we're receiving, and accreditations that are in place, and who's making sure that we are getting that. That has surely got to be part of our story about making sure that we get value for money, we're getting the quality for the cost that we're paying out for our supply chain products. And I know from your experience in other sectors, Aaron, we're not alone in terms of being worried about what it is that we're getting, and are people keeping up with their accreditations? Do we keep an accreditations register? Do we know when people are slipping on that? That's the risk sometimes between the procurement and contract management hand-on, isn't it? That things slide, and before you know it, you're not quite got the right people doing the right sort of work, and then you do remediation, and then you get into all sorts of costs. It happens, and particularly in a context of disrepair claims, bogus, or a lot of them quite fair and reasonable. Have we actually had the right people working on the right stuff? And did they purport to be having the right accreditations? I think it's really one of those fringes of fraud for us.
That's a really good place to end, just keeping people's minds wide and open to all the possibilities. Well, look, everyone, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I know it's a lot to give up an hour and talk about and listen, and we all have busy days, as we know we're all very busy. If you want to get in touch or stay involved in the group, or come meet us at the conference, Paul is going to put up a slide now just about the registration for the conference. We'll keep that open for a couple of minutes, but thank you all. And I hope you've taken at least one thing away today that will help you. But thanks again, everybody.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks a lot.